My name is John Wood Jr. I'm with an organization called Better Angels. Better Angels is dedicated to the work of political depolarization and really sort of creating a sense of shared identity and common community across political lines, from left to right, Republican, Democrat, and everything else in between. But of course, within these groups falls many other categories. And one of the things that is really a difficult matter for us to deal with in the context of our politics today, and our society more generally speaking, is race. Race relations. It's one of the great challenges of American history, maybe the great challenge of American history. And so I come to this subject with a great investment and a great interest in seeing to it that we can find ways to love and empathize with each other across the racial and the ideological divide. So I came to politics as a political candidate. A number of years ago, I was a nominee for Congress in Los Angeles. And I had a bit of a canned opening line, which some of you may have heard, but for those who haven't, it's not quite, hasn't gotten old on everybody yet. I was 26 years old at the time, and people would ask me, they would say, what qualifies you, the age of 26, to run to represent a district as complex and diverse as the California 43rd in Los Angeles? I would tell people, because it was a mixed district, multicultural, predominantly inner city, predominantly African American and Latino, but with a contingency of Republicans and suburban middle class white people in it as well. And I would tell people, I would say, well, I come from a unique sort of background. My mother happens to be a liberal black Democrat from inner city Los Angeles. My father happens to be a conservative white Republican from Tennessee. I grew up explaining my father to my mother and my mother to my father, and that's why I think I can represent a lot of you. So. And now my father didn't particularly love that story, because with him it was kind of technically true. He was born in Tennessee, but he grew up in Los Angeles, grew up a Democrat, became a Republican or conservative later. He was one of those folks who felt like the Democratic Party had kind of left him behind in some sense. But one of the reasons why the story was valuable is because it gave me the opportunity to tell stories to people in the district, to people in my community, that was able to show people the fact that at the end of the day, we have all of these differences between us, but there are things that weave us together into a common story. What I've discovered is that the most powerful tool for communicating empathy and shared identity in the context of our common community is the tool of stories. Stories lubricated by the ethic of love, I would say. And so my father, he is a conservative, he is a person from the South. Even though his politics shifted over time, he raised me in a very traditionalist sort of way in many respects, raised me to believe that the United States of America was the greatest country on earth, that there was something unique and exceptional about our culture and so forth. But my father was a person whose heroes in life growing up were Willie Mays and Muhammad Ali and Bill Evans, white jazz pianists who came to fame playing with John Coltrane and Miles Davis. My dad was a person who loved black culture from the very beginning, a person who had spent his career, he's a jazz musician himself, playing with black musicians, working with black artists, and he raised 2 black sons who he loved more than anyone else in this world. So I was able to talk to people in the inner city community and say, I know we've got feelings about Tea Party supporters and conservatives and so forth, but the stereotypical image that we have in our mind is not always the image that reflects the individual in reality, and so we have to recall the common humanity that exists between us, because these stories are real. And one of the things I was able to do in campaigning in front of conservatives in the community, talking to Republicans in Los Angeles and elsewhere, was to talk about the inner city stories that they don't know and the reasons why people of color feel a certain way oftentimes, feel a certain sense of inward conflict about our love for this country, the United States of America. Because on the one hand, there is no limit to the inspiring stories that the black community has to tell, and I speak to that because I have a particular connection to that. But on the other hand, there is a history of difficulty that a lot of people have a difficult time having a window into. So sometimes people will ask the question, they'll say, well, why is it that folks maybe on the left and folks of color have a difficult time sort of embracing the greatness of America? And America is a great country. It's a beautiful country. But if we talk about the history of this particular group of people, we all know about slavery. We can go back 200 years to a time when people were in bondage. And we can recall that coming out of slavery, there was 100 years of Jim Crow oppression. If we talk about people who live in the Jordan Downs projects today, and this thread will connect itself in a moment, just to let you know, I lived for a year in the Jordan Downs projects. I married a woman from the Jordan Downs. I, on one side of my family, have white millionaires, and on the other side of my family, have black people from the inner city. I grew up in 3 different areas: multicultural, middle-class Culver City, day to day. Spent the weekends with my inner city relatives on the black side of my family. On Saturdays and Sundays, and on holidays, I went to visit my wealthy white relatives in La Jolla County and city in San Diego. They had a house right down the street from Mitt Romney's, the one with the car elevator, if you guys can recall that. I knew, and after marrying my wife and living in the Jordan Downs projects for a year, I met black people in the Jordan Downs who had never been to the beach in Santa Monica. And that seems like an impossible thing. So you go to slavery, you think 200 years in bondage, you come out of that, the difficulty of Reconstruction, segregation, terrorist oppression at the hands of the Ku Klux Klan. Many black people living in the South, when you got into the middle part of the 20th century, moved out to the West Coast for the opportunities to work in the munitions factories during World War II. That's how people wound up in the Jordan Downs projects and the Imperial Courts, the major housing projects in the West Coast. But manufacturing opportunities ultimately went to China. Economies changed domestically. And during the 1960s, a time when we think of as representing great social progress in the United States, you also had the decapitation of black leadership. You had changes in policies that, through the Great Society programs, gave us a way to subsist. But with the erosion of economic opportunities, subsistence didn't provide a sense of community, and so social ambition wound up going in the direction of joining gangs that were flushed with drugs coming in from outside of the country. The domestic economy, the way to find ourselves in a situation to where we had a sense of community around us, was tied to a life of crime and violence, and then mass incarceration comes on top of that. And it leads us to a situation to where, to this very day, in 2019, we have young black men living in inner city housing developments and projects whose only experience with white people has been experience with aggressive police officers, overworked social workers, and public school teachers who very oftentimes mean well but can't keep up with the demands of the job. Tell me, at what point in this story has a young person in the Jordan Downs projects who comes from this history ever truly been free? And so it's nobody's fault alive today that this history was set in motion the way it has been. But it does leave us to a situation to where this young man's experience in America has been circumscribed in a vicious sort of way, and yet we wonder, why can't this young man love America the way we do? You know? I'm a young black man, but my experience was different than my brothers in the projects and so forth, right? And yet, on the other hand, it's important to remember that when we talk about suffering in the American experience, in American history, in American reality, day by day, we're not just talking about black folks and Latinos and LGBTQ community and other people of color and marginalized folks, because frankly, white people have suffered in this country too. And when we think about people who, let's say they voted for Donald Trump, let's say they're people who we think of as having a backwards point of view towards multiculturalism, towards America as a melting pot, a place to assimilate. We oftentimes talk in terms of wanting to sort of get away from that type of whiteness, you know? Talk about whiteness sometimes as kind of a blinding kind of thing that certain people wear, and they can't see past it because of privilege and so on and so forth. And look, terms like white privilege, they speak to a particular reality. But if you're a young person living in the Appalachian South, your ancestors were people who were not slave owners for the most part, by and large. Your ancestors were people who were looked down and spat upon by wealthy Northerners before the Civil War era, as well as wealthy Southern plantation owners. Your ancestors were people who were pressed into a battle to defend your soil that you really had no business fighting, that wasn't in your interest, and you did it because that's what the community was telling you to do. And you fast forward 100 years through rural poverty, and you go to the difficulties of the civil rights movement, and we see the social progress being made in America adopting this conviction that says that, okay, you haven't solved all these problems, but we hear you, Martin Luther King Jr., with your dream, and we want to bring young black boys and girls together. So let's integrate the schools, let's integrate the armed forces, let's do things to make things more equal. But a lot of us white folks, and now I'm speaking as a white folk too, by the way, a lot of us white folks are going to put the moral blame of racism on the shoulders of people in rural communities, people in religious communities, people who never had as much opportunity as so many of us who grew up in the cosmopolitan and metropolitan centers of American life, those of us who had the opportunity to go to academies to succeed in entertainment. There's a cultural narrative that comes forth where some of us white folks are able to sort of bolster our claim of nobility by disassociating ourselves from whiteness because it doesn't mean anything to us. We're woke, right? We have a sense of sophistication about us. It's these poor, rural, dirt farming Christian people that are really the problem. Even though we had racism in Los Angeles, we had redlining that kept people in Watts and living along the Crenshaw corridor and in Inglewood from being able to move westward to buy a house in Inglewood because corrupt real estate practices wouldn't allow them to purchase home. They couldn't move east across the Alameda corridor because they get beaten by the cops. That happened in LA. There was plenty of racism in New York City. There's plenty of racism in the urban establishment, but we just act like it's these poor country folks who got a problem. And I'm saying that's not fair. Now look, I'm not here talking to you guys today because I want to blame anyone for anything. We have to take moral responsibility for our past. It's definitely true. I know this clap thing gets on people's nerves a little bit, the Twitter clap, but it's kind of a black thing. A lot of people don't realize that, but so y'all know what I'm talking about. But the thing that I come back to in my own thoughts about this is the fact that if we predicate our goal of creating a common American community, in some sense of a shared American identity, upon somebody's ability to win a polemical argument, then it's never going to happen. There is truth, and we should all be striving for the objective truth. But we are all destined to strive for the objective truth from the vantage point of our subjective personal experiences. We've all lived different lives. So is there anything that can transcend our differences in the project of trying to create community? And my answer to you is that yes, there is. It is the power of love. Through nonviolence, love as a social value. Somebody asked me, what does love like that mean? Martin Luther King Jr. described love, agape love, as not affection or romantic interest, but rather as an overriding sense of goodwill towards the other person, even and perhaps especially towards your opponent. It's the type of love that Arthur Brooks writes about in his recent piece, Love Thine Enemies. Love Your Enemies. And Martin Luther King Jr., in talking about integration and the need for us to transcend racism, he didn't talk about it in merely structural terms. Of course, Dr. King was very committed to remedying the mechanisms of structural oppression, but that was the beginning. It was a subcomponent of a larger moral mission. Dr. King made an active distinction between desegregation, which was removing the barriers that stand between us and being able to occupy the same lunch counter, go to the same schools. He made a distinction between desegregation, which was necessary, but technical, and integration, which is an affirmative matter of the heart. Dr. King described integration as representing the positive, quote, the positive acceptance of the full range of human activity, that it is, quote, an affirmative intergroup and interperson activity. Dr. King sought integration. He didn't seek desegregation. And integration comes when we find ourselves able to recognize the thou-ness in the other person, the fundamental human dignity, meaning that in every word we speak to another person, even and including our oppressors, if we see someone else as oppressing us, we speak that word to him or her with that person's benefit in our minds and in our hearts. So Martin Luther King Jr. is not here today, but his example remains with us. If you're speaking to a Trump supporter whose policies you feel are an active threat to your community or to yourself, Dr. King would advise you to speak to that person in love. Speak to that person with truth, but speak to that person with that person's own well-being in your heart and in your mind, and not just your own community. And if you're a Trump supporter or conservative and you feel that the policies of the progressive or the liberal left are ones that are uprooting us from these countries' historic values, from our histories, and you're concerned about the consequences of big government, so on and so forth, have that conversation. But have it with a heart towards lifting up the well-being and the goodness of the person with whom you are debating in mind. And see, there's an innate humility that comes in this way of communicating, because it requires us to accept the fact that on the one hand, we're always going to be rooted to our opinions, but on the other hand, our opinions are our opinions, and they may strive towards truth, but truth, moral truth, is a thing greater than us all. We can only realize it in a corporate, collective sort of fashion. That too is integration. Us joining together in the project of developing community through love. That should be the higher objective of our social strivings, for which politics is just a little piece at the end of the day. Anybody who tells you that this way of looking at our social and political relationships is naive or impractical, please correct them in a gentle way, because the only option we have, aside from ultimately coming together in a spirit of love, is rending our civil fabric in acts of violence. Because societies will go in one direction or another. We don't maintain an equilibrium of what King would call negative peace, the type of peace that is really just the absence of violent conflict. Well, the absence of violent conflict in the absence of love only lasts for a while. Love either comes rushing in to bring us closer together, or fear and hatred radically pull us apart. And you get a civil war in the 1860s. Guess what? We had great violence in the 1960s, but we didn't have a civil war then. We had a moral message that came through, an ethic of love as a transformational social value that allowed us to amplify and restore a sense of common community, and even beyond restoring it, that allowed us to call upon the traditional and conservative values of this country in order to justify an attempt to realize a more progressive and perfect sort of liberal view of what the future could be. Dr. King spoke a language that appealed to everybody's emotional and moral foundations, because love allows you to do just that. When people are coming from a human place, that means they have something in common with you. And so I ask you all to remember that, to adopt this ethos of love and nonviolence in your heart, and to then apply that to the act of community building, because that's what's special about this moment. This audience is an unlikely crowd, let me tell you, especially after talking to a few of y'all for 3 or 4 minutes. It's like, how do we all get in a room together, you know? That didn't happen automatically, except that the better angels of our natures have carried us here. And now we're wondering in this moment, how do we transform this creative energy and this enthusiasm, given the fact that we still, all of us, have all sorts of differences, culturally, politically, etc. How do we transform all of this into a movement towards community building that is able to contend with the forces of polarization and division in our society? And my answer to that is that, first of all, there are a lot of people doing individual and organizational things that can fit together in a structural way that would allow us to employ nonviolence in a manner in this generation, not merely to oppose corrupt laws, but to actually build noble structures, and that's vital. But there's also a spirit to our work here which will allow us to articulate a message of love that is more powerful than the tones of division coming from the right or the left. Because it's not about right or left. It's about humanity. And that should be what it is to be an American, black or white. With that. I was nervous before I stepped up here, y'all, by the way. By the way, I was like, I might stick my foot in my mouth, I don't know. But thank you all so much. And so now we want to have a conversation with the whole room. I think that we have about 15 minutes for that, if I'm not mistaken. And so this is your time. I'm just here to kind of facilitate the dialogue. I know that everybody here has feelings about the issue of race, how it plays into the divisions of our society, our personal experiences and ideas or challenges within ourselves in terms of how we deal with this vast issue in order to create a better and more cohesive society. A beloved community is what Dr. King called it, and I think that's what we strive for.